Started. My name is Robyn Smith, and I'm a data scientist working on CREED projects in the Consumer Finance Institute here at the Federal Reserve of Philadelphia. And today I'm going to be talking about one of CREED's big initiatives, which is locating racial covenants in Philadelphia. And as I do work at the Fed, standard disclaimers do apply. So we are looking at property deeds in Philadelphia from 1910 to 1965, which coincides with the Great Migration, which is what we refer to as the mass migration of Black Americans from the South to the North over about a 50, 60-year period here. And these maps from the Census Bureau, which unfortunately are a little washed out here, are basically showing you in the dark colored circles are cities where the proportion of the Black population decreased, whereas the yellow, red, and sort of warm tone colors are cities where the Black population increased, or the proportion of the Black population increased. And we do often think about this happening in two separate waves roughly after each World War. So the first Great Migration, the second Great Migration. In both cases, you do see a lot of movement to like what we might call the Rust Belt cities, as well as the Mid-Atlantic region. And then in the second Great Migration, we do see the West Coast opening up as well. So if we look specifically at the population of Philadelphia during this time period, this is just using decennial census information from 1860 to 1970, we can see the overall population in yellow in the background and the Black population in the foreground in blue. And this is about where we think of the Great Migration beginning. So prior to this, you can see that the number of Black residents in Philadelphia is fairly constant, and then it starts to tick up. And we can also think about this in terms of proportion of the population. So again, following 1910, you start to see this climbing more dramatically. But I also want to call attention to the fact what the entire population. And so that's mainly attributed to a lot of immigration, particularly from Western Europe. But you can imagine any city that goes through this kind of growth spurt, this is going to put a lot of strain on the housing stock. People need to live somewhere. So in response to this, what we see if we look at the number of annual housing permits issued, a few gaps in this data from various sources, but we see especially in 1920, where we think about during sort of in the middle a little bit after the first Great Migration begins, you see this enormous housing boom followed by some secondary ones later on. And then just for reference, so in terms of the more recent collective memory of this room, these are the housing permits issued from 1980 to 2020. So when we call this a housing boom, these numbers are really just providing context of what I mean by there was a lot of housing built in Philadelphia. So the vast majority of what we think of as Philadelphia even was built in this time period here. And actually, there's a couple booms that are actually even further back, again, attributed to immigration from Europe as well. So the majority of Philadelphia built during this time period. That's the real takeaway here. Okay, so you can imagine not only was the population growing, but again, the demographics began shifting. And as we see time and time again, this increased a lot of racial tension. And so the white population was quite invested and interested in both maintaining and enforcing segregation in housing. And there's a couple channels that can operate through. So you have violence and intimidation. So Red Summer of 1919, those cities that we saw in the first slide, the Rust Belt cities in Mid-Atlantic, pretty much all of those cities experienced race riots during this time period. Philadelphia did as well. The majority of them, just like the one in Philadelphia, was spurred by a Black family moving to a white block. In Philadelphia, that was at 25th and Pine, I believe, was the block. So not terribly far from here. Then we have our real estate agents. This is the actual code of ethics from 1924, which states a realtor should never be instrumental in introducing into a neighborhood members of any race or nationality whose presence will clearly be detrimental to property values in that neighborhood. So the prevailing opinion at this time was that anybody who is not white living in a property would tank its value. And so that's going to be a prevailing theme that comes across in all of these things and what's underpinning a lot of the actions we're seeing. Then Baltimore takes the plunge in 1910 and just goes straight to the race-based zoning ordinances. Those are struck down by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1917. Of course, in that interim time, a bunch of cities followed suit. And then we find the racial covenants in property deeds. So they're found as early as 1855. They were actually ruled constitutional originally in 1926, which you can imagine increased the popularity and usage of them, until they were ruled unconstitutional in Shelley v. Kramer in 1948. And I do like the phrasing in the St. Louis Star-Times here, where they say it's unenforceable, which is really what the unconstitutional ruling does, is say that you can no longer enforce this using the courts. Needless to say, privately, these continue to be enforced for quite a long time. So again, we get to the FHA, which we were just hearing about. They preferred and certainly desired a lot of their properties that were part of their lending programs to carry covenants. So that was a big factor in their usage as well. And then basically they're legally privately enforceable until the Fair Housing Act of 1968. So covenants in general, though, the use of covenants themselves were quite standard. So this is really in the time period before citywide zoning ordinances are standardized and in wide usage. So any property would carry this list of covenants, basically stating what was the property meant to be used for. What was it, residential, commercial, industrial? It was basically how zoning was accomplished before there was zoning. So in this sample, you can see there are no buildings shall be used or occupied as a coal yard, slaughterhouse, bone boiling establishment, piggery, stable, public garage, moving picture theater, or place of amusement of any kind. There will be no chickens or pigeons or animals of an offensive nature shall be allowed, and shall not at any time hereafter be used as a house of prostitution, gambling house, public drinking house, or saloon. Goes on and on. But if you continue reading this, what we find is typically at the end of these restrictions is what we find is of what we consider a racial covenant. So an agreement added to a property deed restricting the sale or use of the property based on race, ethnicity, or religion. So this one says, nor shall any lot or lots or premises be hereafter at any time occupied or conveyed to any one of the Jewish race or to any one of those of the Caucasian race. So in Philadelphia, the vast majority of the deeds we're going to be looking at are going to restrict to Caucasian race or Caucasian descent. That is the prevailing terminology used in Philadelphia. The language you'll find in these racial covenants does vary city by city, so you can imagine the racial language found on the West Coast. It tends to be very different from the language found on the East Coast. Interestingly, the sample is one of the few in Philadelphia. We have maybe 10 that we know of that actually does explicitly call out religion. So that was, while it did happen, it was very rare in our sample. So there's a couple common places you might think to find racial covenants. And the first is bordering existing Black neighborhoods. So Philadelphia actually has the largest population of Black residents outside of slaveholding states, pretty much up until this period. And so we have a very long and vibrant history of our Black neighborhoods, and they're fairly well established heading into this period. And what you see happens, this is work by Larry Santucci, which I'm going to talk about more later. You can see the covenants are found bordering these blocks that are predominantly Black, and we see that with the hope of the white residents nearby being that that Black neighborhood would not expand its borders. Interestingly enough, one of our interns, Isabel, looked at these. This is actually the cluster in Philadelphia that also carry citizenship clauses. So there's only a handful and they're all located here. And so we found out that this block also has a lot of Italian immigrants. So it was used in various ways. And then, of course, in new construction, again, those building booms that we're seeing, a lot of the new construction was reserved for white occupants. And again, this also gets tied up in the FHA lending practices for builders. So the FHA says, they'll insure the loan if the new homes carry these covenants. So that really increased their usage as well. And this is from the Philadelphia Inquirer. So our sample lives at the Philadelphia City Archives. That actual building is about a 10-minute walk. I can't do it. 10-minute walk north of here. And they actually house all of the original deed books at this location. They also store all of the microfilm that exists that has been taken of these books, and they are in possession of the digital images that have been scanned from the microfilm. So for our sample from 1910 to 1965, we're talking about 6,400 rolls of microfilm, about 4.7 million images, 7 million pages, and about 2 million deeds. And so our general methodology in this project is going to be to read them, store them, and make them searchable so we can try to identify those that carry this language in them. All right, so this is what I want to be very clear. This is the number of images in our sample. So this is the microfilm scanned to digital. And this is broken down by year. The y-axis is number of images in the thousands. So there's a couple things that stick out here. Yes, we are in fact missing data here. Very unfortunately, in 1947 and 1948, right around the Shelley v. Kramer ruling. So we are currently in discussion with the Department of Records, who are fabulous, about filling those. It looks like the data does exist. It has not been lost. It's just we don't have it. So we're working on locating it and getting it into the sample. We have two other dips here and there that we're kind of keeping an eye on at lower priority, but we're not 100% sure if we're missing data or if those are in fact real. And then the other thing you might notice is after 1950 or so, it looks like the number of images doubles. So was there a lot of real estate transactions? Are there more deeds there? And it turns out prior to that period, one image was 2 pages of the book, whereas following 1951, they go to scanning 1 page per image. So the number of images doubles. What do these look like? Okay, so we break our sample into 4 broad categories. 1910 to 1913 are our handwritten deed samples. So there are various transcribers. So we have quite a large number of handwriting samples in this. That's not all consistent, and it's about 172,000 images. Then we go to the typewritten transcriptions of the deed. So those are 1913 to 1935, about 1.3 billion images. And in my opinion, those are definitely the easiest ones to read. 1936 to 51, about 1 million images is when they start basically kind of scanning the book or the original documents in their entirety. So I tend to refer to this as like the original document format, as opposed to being a transcription, which is happening in the handwritten and the typewritten. And then again in 1951, 52, around there, about 2 million images where there's only 1 page per image, but it is those original documents again. So our first step in sort of tackling this project was we want to read these deeds. So that means optical character recognition, OCR. Now, the quality of your OCR is directly related to the quality of your images, the consistency of your formatting, and even just like the fonts used, whether it's typewritten, handwritten, how many different types are represented. And as you can see from this, we're scoring really low in all of those categories. So we went into this knowing that our OCR was not going to be at a level that's considered acceptable for other projects. Like, we know that a priori. And what our hope is that because we are searching for such distinctive language, that we have an idea of what, that we're looking for something specific, that even if the OCR in bulk is of low quality, we're going to be able to pull out the things that we're looking for. So that's sort of the rationale that we're using here. So we do use Amazon Textract. In some early initial testing, we wanted to use something off the shelf. Again, we have almost 5 million images. We are not going through and creating custom models for every handwriting, every format change, anything like that. We are taking it off the shelf and using it as is. Textract performed best in that category, again, and just using the default settings, we found it to work best. So we're using that for our OCR. We are capturing the bounding boxes of every word, and we are keeping the confidence estimates that Textract provides. And then that raw OCR is then ingested into OpenSearch. So in OpenSearch parlance, that's called building an index. You can think of an index as a database, sort of analogous to like a NoSQL, if you're familiar. And during that ingestion is when the raw OCR output is going to be tokenized, which is really kind of your first step in any natural language processing, steps you want to do down the line. Tokenization is the first step. It's also going to be what helps us both search more efficiently through this data set, and it's going to help us with, when it returns a search result, attempting to rank them in orders of relevance. So that's something OpenSearch is designed to do. And then the other big step that happened here is splitting the images into documents. So again, documents is just the phrase that is the term that OpenSearch uses, but you can think of it as a record in your database. And so what I mean by that is that up until this point, we basically just have a string of 5 million images in some like vaguely chronological order. And so what we need to do is we want to split them into our individual records. And our goal is that there would be one deed to one record, one document. So if we imagine this is just pages of a deed, the little gray boxes are representing where a deed begins. If we were to split this into documents, we would hope that we would see 4 separate documents in this segment of images. And so it's not just a simple segmentation, right? Because you can see the third image here actually belongs to the first document, and the second document because of the fact that the deeds spill over. So we do have an automated algorithm that's doing this, basically attempting to detect what's being represented by these boxes here. And it does work overall quite well, but we do know for a fact that at times it is merging our deeds together. So we may have one document that's holding multiple deeds. So our interns worked very hard on a labeled sample this summer, and it's the first large sample we've had access to since the algorithm has been used. Turns out it's maybe not performing quite as well as we had hoped or how it had indicated in initial testing. So this is very much something on our radar to try to improve and keep going. But so this will come up that, when we talk about our search results, we are talking about them in terms of documents. So now that we've built our index, we've split up our images into our individual records, we're ready to do what's called a fuzzy search, which basically just means we're not looking for perfect exact matches. We're willing to accept typos or differences, and how different a word is from one can be quantified. This uses the Demro-Levenstein distance because it includes the transpositions here. But this is calculated at a character level, so you can either have replacements, deletions, insertions, or the adjacent transposition. So for the word Caucasian, this is just an automatically generated list by OpenSearch that all of these words here would be considered a match to the word Caucasian. Now, you do have to be careful about how many edits you permit, how many of these, whether it's replacement or different edits, are permitted, because if you do allow too many, it basically ends up your search results are dominated by false positives. You're basically letting in too many matches of what you're not actually looking for. So the kind of standard rule is that for words with more than 5 characters, you're going to permit up to 2 edits, whereas characters 3 to 5, only 1 edit distance. So Caucasian falls here, so we allow up to 2 edit distance or 2 edits. Here is where race falls. We allow only up to 1 edit. So how are we doing? So this is a picture of a real deed, and the raw OCR output is exactly reproduced here. And the only really major thing that sticks out is that the M and premises has been transcribed as an I and an N. And you can see that there's a little bit of degradation in the original text here. So you can kind of see how that might happen. But overall, this is an example of where, quite frankly, we're doing really great. And our OCR is actually performing very well. Now let's talk about this one. This is one of the original deed documents. So this is what the entire image looks like. We're only considering the top part of the right page right now. And this is the raw OCR output. So this tag here is what's inserted into the raw OCR by our algorithm to say, hey, I found the phrase this indenture. That means this is the start of a new deed, and it should be the start of a new document. And now if we follow this first line here, we can see that it's transcribing fairly well, but when it gets to the second line and hits the handwritten word January, it seems to not know where to go. And so it drops down to the third line and continues reading. Then if we continue in the raw output, we see that then it jumps back up. It does read the word January. It just got confused about where to go at certain points. And then it does drop back down again to where it starts capturing the names. And from there on out, it does transcribe what I would call in reading order, like the way we as humans would read this document. Even though there's some strange white space, there's diagonal lines, or there's horizontal lines, it just omits those, quite frankly, doesn't know what to do with those. But in this case, that's okay. So this is just an example of how, again, especially using something off the shelf is not necessarily going to be prepared to handle all these changes in formatting and all the very different types of text you're throwing at it. And you will see even more examples of this in Dan's talk tomorrow. All right, let's look at handwritten deed. So I'm going to preface this by saying that this is the top of a left page. So there is no text that appears in this image above this line except for a page number that's way off in the margin. Okay. The first line, actually not all that bad. All things considered. I mean, the bar's low. Okay. So what happens, it gets the first couple words and it gets a little confused. This should say no slaughterhouse bone boiling. In defense of the OCR, the person transcribing was clearly running out of room and jammed all 3 words together. So I don't feel a need to penalize it for not putting spaces between those words because I'm not convinced there are spaces there. So, but after this first line, which again, this is the very first line on a page, so it's really obvious for the OCR, the algorithm, to know where to go next because it goes way downhill very quickly. This is the raw OCR. So like if you were not looking at this picture, you would just be handed this paragraph here and said, this is what it says in this order. Clearly, that is not the case. It starts new lines. It gets lost. It doesn't know where to go. It's basically almost reading whatever word it can vaguely on this half of the page at this point. And then a bunch of words actually repeat in this section, but they don't repeat here. And so I didn't even try to match it up because I can't. Maybe if I spent longer, but I'm not confident that these match until we get down to here applying to necessary. So again, this is looking pretty bleak, but look what pops out. Let's see, shall not be sold to or used or occupied by anyone other than one of the Caucasian descent. So even though, again, this is an example, our OCR by standard metrics is not doing great, but it is sufficient enough, especially at a word level, that we're getting a clear read of this racial covenant here. And this, cute little highlight box over there means that when I searched for the word Caucasian, this deed was returned as a positive search result. It was able to locate the word both in the raw OCR and then highlight it on the page for us using the bounding boxes. So again, this is when I said our OCR is not going to be great, but it's working well at a word level for this sort of search purpose. This is really what I mean by that. Oh, and then we get, as a bonus, we get the name Bella Redmond. That's a seller. We actually do care about that, so it's really nice to get a clear read there. So now that we've set up, this is basically for searching for racial covenants in Philadelphia. This is like the list that we've put together of the phrases that we search for. These two here are actually designed to capture line breaks. So the word Caucasian, we see hyphenated a lot. We see CAU. Sometimes there's a hyphen, sometimes not, and then it drops down to the next line. This has turned out to be the most efficient way to capture those. So this is really handling our line break situation. I do want to take a moment that if you are not interested in searching for racial covenants, to point out that the methodology here overall of building this index and investing in this bulk scale OCR is incredibly flexible. You can search for street names, builders, wards, loan associations, people if you want to do genealogy. You can think about all the other data sources you could pull in here. And what we think of this as is like a really rich and fertile data set that we've used that, again, as you find new things, can be used for other purposes. So that's just my aside that even if this isn't what you want to use it for, this data set is going to exist. And again, this methodology for other historical documents where it may be really difficult or not feasible to really obtain that high level OCR, there's still a lot you can do with them. All right, everybody wants to know, how many racial covenants are there in Philadelphia? And I'm going to spend several slides telling you why I don't have a great answer. So this is a deed from 1926. There is our racial covenant on the 4th page. And then if we go back to look at the property description, we see that this is actually for 26 certain lots or ground, grounds, whatever the phrasing is here, pieces of ground. Right, so this means that we have one deed, but 26 covenanted properties. So my question to you is, well, do you want to know how many deeds there are? Or do you want to know how many properties there are? Because those are not the same thing. Most people say they want to know the number of properties, but we are in the process of working on finding ways to pull these numbers out. So once we identify that the deed is carrying a covenant, how do we then pull out, is it for one property or is it covering multiple properties? So that is work in progress. Now let's consider 3914 Sansom Street. This is over in West Philadelphia, over by the University of Pennsylvania. This is also a rental property. You could live there if you wanted. So it is sold by Frederick Cortland Penfield to Isabella Eleanor Royal, I believe, in 1920. Isabella then sends it to James Coleman in 1924, and I've highlighted in the beginning here his wife's name is Anna because James does pass away, and so the next transaction, the seller is listed as Anna Coleman in 1946. And if we look at these deeds in their entirety, what do we see? We see covenant. Whoops, it's not doing it. There's a covenant, there's a covenant, there's a covenant. So once a covenant is added to a deed, it sticks with the property. Yes.
So in all these examples, they're restricting the sale, obviously, to people of Caucasian descent. Do they ever, add negation words in front of those, right? So we don't care if you sell to X or.
I've never seen it. I don't know. Has anybody else in the room? Have you seen it?
Very rarely.
Okay.
You do see notices after Shelley v. Kramer that says, "Hey, if there was a covenant here, it's now void." And so those we do map racial covenants too. So we don't map those, but you also see renunciations of covenants where someone has gone to a judge and say, "I'm taking it off." We still count that as a covenant because there's evidence that there was a covenant there at one point.
Presumably, there's a distinction between the restrictions on Caucasian descended people are presumably you can only sell to them, whereas for minority borrowers, it said you cannot sell.
Oh yeah,
so it could be like some.
Well, so it sounds like in Philadelphia they are mostly getting the whites only.
Yeah.
So it's probably not as much of an issue.
Yeah, this is really only restricting that you can, with the negation, it's about you can only sell to people who are Caucasian, essentially.
Negation is in nor occupied, so that's where, the negative is coming in.
But I would also say, like, if you see a racial term in here, and it's in the sense of a racial term, I know of exactly one covenant in the country that restricted it to only Black people. So, like, it's a racial covenant, like that's targeting people of color. So.
All right, so we've got 3914 Sansom Street. Basically, again, the covenant's sticking with the property, and so for the timing of this, all three of these are going to appear in our sample as positive search results. And so basically we're counting 3914 Sansom Street 3 times because it transacts 3 times during this period. So we are actively working on how do we deduplicate based on transactions. Here I'm showing you I have an address, but the first deed that actually contains an address is in 1946. So the 2 prior deeds are only using meets and bounds descriptions. And this is another example of how can you use this for searching. You can see here that the yellow highlights are actually pulling out everybody's names here. And so basically after finding one, the deeds include the previous seller as well as, the previous seller. And so you can use that to try to do linking and trying to find the deeds in what order they go. So it's just an example of other things you can search for. So again, this is also impacting our counts of how many racial covenants are there in Philadelphia. So what I can show you is what we kind of refer to as documents with covenant mentions. So this is when we search the entire corpus of all of the documents in our index, how many of them are returning positive search results for one of the terms that's in our search list. This is what that looks like. We're at about a little over 5,000, 5,200 in this time period that are returning positive results. Now, this is kind of a strange looking distribution. Basically, the number plummets at 1930. And so there's a couple things we're going to discuss to maybe not fully explain this pattern, but at least what's contributing to it. Oh dear, that's not very visible. All right, just for reference so that we have this, if we keep that in mind. I don't want to get into exactly what this is measuring, but the goal was to make a very crude proxy to assess the quality of our images. And so this is grouping images by month, by year, and then looking at the standard deviation of the percentage of the white pixels. With the idea being is that if the standard deviation is high, it means that the images in this group are not similar to each other, when we would hope that the quality would be at least kind of similar or uniform. And so a high variability here doesn't mean that all the images are bad. It's just more likely that at least some of the images in that section are bad. And you can see that the variability that we're using here really jumps up after 1935, which also coincides when they switched from the typewritten transcriptions to scanning the original deed documents. So this is probably a combination of both the formatting change, and we do also see just in working through this data sample that the actual image quality in terms of whether a page is completely washed out in white, so we've lost all the text, or it's not exposed enough and the entire page is black and we've still lost all the text. Just seems to be more common in this time period. So I certainly would not attribute the entire dearth of covenant mentions here to this effect, but I do certainly believe that that's an impact here, is that, again, the quality of the images just deteriorates systematically at a certain point. The other thing we're going to talk about, so this is a deed from 1963, which very helpfully has an address. Later on, when addresses are more standardized, it's more common to see them in a deed. This is 5002 Stenton Avenue, which is under and subject to certain restrictions of record, which is not very helpful. But we can go back and find this in 1930. So, which again, only roughly, our interns have found about a third of the deeds in this sort of time period may actually have like a full house number with them. This happens to be one of them. So this is for 5000 and 5002 Stenton Avenue. So they transact together in this deed. And if we keep reading, lo and behold, it contains a racial covenant. So at some point, sometimes as early as 1940, what we're seeing is that they're no longer spelling out the certain restrictions of record. They're just adding phrases similar to that saying, hey, there are a bunch of building restrictions on this property. You have to go back and look them up. Best case scenario, they provide sometimes maybe like the first time they do that, they seem to be providing the exact book and page number like of the deed so that it might be easier to look up to see what those restrictions are. But often we're seeing it just says certain restrictions of record. And so I think this is a larger factor. And why do we suddenly see no covenant mentions after 1930? Certainly later on, these properties are still covenanted. As Michael sort of mentioned, like these things are very hard to remove. There's also resistance to moving them from like a legal precedent record point of view. And so if you're lucky, you might be able to attach an annulment or add language to it saying, disavowing that, but the removal of these is not happening. So you can assume, especially this one, occasionally you would see time limits here when it would, quote, expire, not as common. So given that the 1930 deed contains this covenant, you would absolutely say that 5002 Stenton Avenue is still a covenant property here in 1963. Now, I do want to point out in terms of counting covenants, though, this may not be a bug. It may be a feature for that purpose, because we're not actually double counting 5002 Stenton Avenue in this case because the deed does not have the language. So, it's both good and bad that this is happening. So what we can also do is compare with some previous methods. So Larry Santucci here at the CFI and the Philadelphia Fed from a time period of, starting in 2017 or so, began working with a sample of Philadelphia deeds, actually all the deeds in Philadelphia from 1920 to 1933, and used a combination of, they were using Abbey Finereader for their OCR and using sort of like a pseudo engram approach to identify deeds that may have covenants, and then going through and hand validating the entire thing. So this is essentially entirely a hand validated set here in the aqua color. And one of the takeaways here is that with OpenSearch and the index we've built, we're finding about 22% more covenant mentions than with the other methods. So we do think we are turning up far more of these deeds than previously. Full transparency, given that Larry's is a hand-validated sample and ours is fully automated, I do suspect his false positive rate is noticeably smaller than ours. But I do believe that even accounting for that, unfortunately, we don't have a really confident handle on what ours is at the moment. We're working towards that. I do believe that we are finding more. Yeah, Michael.
The city deeds stuff in 33.
Oh, no, that's just where they stop. City Archives has up until 74. Yeah, and then after 74, they're already digitized and they are housed by a different department somebody else has them. But yeah, so the images of this type go up to 74 and they go back to, I believe, 1780. Yeah, they go all the way back. And my understanding is that they're already scanned. They're just sitting on a server. It's my understanding. Yeah.
You refer to sort of annulling them or negating them. I think in the Minneapolis ones, I've seen like the language a few times of like, you can't, it runs with the property.
Yeah.
You've seen that in these ones?
We haven't searched for it. I also don't think so. In the searchable part, it only goes to 65, which isn't even up until the Civil Rights Act of 68. So I wouldn't necessarily expect to find it in our sample, if I'm being honest.
I'd say like even in modern times when states have passed laws to quote unquote remove covenants, they're not removing it from the chain of title.
No.
So like that's, you do see it a little bit in Torrance property, if you're familiar with Torrance property. It kind of drops off the list, but those mentions where we have of like getting rid of it, like actually getting rid of it, are pretty rare. I mean, I would say it's like under 1% of the cases where that happens.
All right, so we can also talk about a couple other ways. How are we doing compared to, that's just my pointing out. Somehow Larry had a roll of film that we didn't get. We are not really sure how that happened, but I'm feeling a little defensive about 1922. And I just want to point out that he had like probably 3,000 more images than we did. So just wanted to, people were interested in that column earlier. So, all right, so Larry's sample again is basically fully hand validated. And so it also contains the date of the transaction as well as the seller info and the exact covenant language that was used. So if I were to build the query using all of that information, but baking that into the query, we recover 93% of his sample. So obviously the 7%, it works out to like 189 deeds or so. We're looking at by hand to try to understand why did we not catch it, and then trying to see if there's ways that we can improve our search methodology so that we can kind of close the gap so that we're at least recovering all of Larry's. There is definitely some cases where I think my sneaking suspicion is because of they used it wasn't a pure n-gram search, but I think the way that they were using the Abby Fine Reader is just slightly different enough from what we were doing that I think they're capturing some that just Textract and the OCR would struggle to recover. So that's something we're looking at. All right. And then, like I said, our interns worked on a labeled sample. That labeled sample is about half the size of what Larry's sample was. But when they are going through and reviewing and labeling additional information in Larry's sample, we're also recovering then what the document ID is in Larry's sample corresponding to our sample, so we can check that way as well. So if I do like an uninformed search and say, hey, if I just search this period of deeds without all the other information that Larry's already collected, how many of those are we finding? And we're finding about 75%. So this is a small sample. It's about 1,500 deeds, which is a ton to go through by hand. But so we're also looking at those to try to understand those cases where there's certainly cases where we're recovering deeds that Larry found because he was providing the seller's name. So we're not returning positive searches based on the covenant phrase, but because of the seller name. So that's kind of what's being captured in this number here. Okay. So next steps, we do want to geo-reference these deeds. In a lot of Larry's work, they were mapped to the closest intersection because meets and bounds descriptions are just unpleasant to work with and very difficult and time intensive. So they were mapped to the nearest location or the nearest intersection. And what we hope to do is we have a couple ideas in the pipeline that we're testing of how we could try to automate that process or at least get it a little closer, with the goal of at a minimum at least mapping them to the correct block so that it can be matched with census blocks housing statistics. Oop. My bad. There we go. All right. We want to be able to expand the number so we can go from deeds to the number of properties, but then also deduplicate because of the transactions. And then, like I said, City Archives has these going back further. So in this expansion, sort of going from Larry's sample, then expanding out to 1910 to 1965, we only captured 3 years of handwritten deeds. So we were really using this as a test case in a lot of ways of how was this going to perform on the handwritten deeds. We didn't want to go and spend a lot of effort working through the handwritten ones if it was going to turn out to not work at a level we thought was acceptable. So far, we're pretty happy with how it's going. Certainly room for improvement, but we're happy with it. So we're looking to get the deeds back to 1840, which we're also just excited about because it'll allow us to start to observe the point at which covenants are added to properties. So that 3914 Sansom Street that I showed you, the transaction in 1920, the previous transaction of that property is dated 1846, I believe. But obviously that's outside of our window right now, so we can't go easily look it up. We want to start being able to go back and at least checking the deeds further back to see if we can observe when the covenant is appearing. All right, so that's what I've got for folks. Thank you so much.